Oxana Timofeeva, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Philosophy of Russian Academy of Sciences. She's everywhere she's senior, and senior lecturers on contemporary philosophy at European University in St. Petersburg, and also senior member of collective Что делать. And yes, and senior member of not, and here is not senior member of editorial board of the journal Stasis, also, and also
junior member.
Yes, and also author of books History of Animals and Essay of Negativity, Immanence and Freedom, published in Maastricht in 2009, and Introduction to Erotic Philosophy of George Bataille, published in Moscow in same year, actually, 2009. So. She was also an editor of New Literature Observer magazine until 2012, a researcher of the theory department of Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht until 2011, and this enough information for you to and the title of the talk is sorry, because the non-human as such, yeah.
The non-human as such. This will be the talk somehow in, let's say, critical dialogue with what Katie characterized at the introduction to this conference as a post-humanist trap or something like this. So I will reflect a little bit about this idea of the return of the non-human. So that's like they talk about the return of the non-human into, let's say, human science and so on. This idea of the return or the non-human turn of humanities, and also like all of philosophy with these ideas of post-humanism, speculative realism, feminist gentle materialism, and so on and so forth, all this addressing to the non-human agencies. This idea of the appearance of the return of the non-human while being taken for granted implies an interesting moment of confusion. What, if anything, is a non-human? Where does it return from, and where does it turn? A reply seems to be on the surface. A non-human is anything but human. It can be an elephant, a diamond, a wasp, a robot, a flower, a cloud, a cyborg, a stone, a computer program, a star, a work of art, a zombie. There is an endless list of worldly things that are different from the human being. They return from a long exile of ontological and epistemological subordination to the human, who, by historically expanding his habitat, appointed himself the hope of the universe. They return from the shadow of the human and turn their back to him in order to face their own non-human existence as autonomous object, as alternative subjects, as irreducible singularities, or as material agencies, as intensities, as bodies, as media, as forms of life. Heterogeneous multiplicity of non-humans provides abundant resources and potentials for the study of culture. But above all, it haunts the entire domain of humanities. In their increasingly developing receptivity to significant otherness, which constitutes and shapes the limits of the human, humanities are getting pregnant with the non-human. Various attempts to imagine or to theorize a world before, after, apart from, or simply without humans, a world outside the anthropocentric horizon, endowing with the privilege of universality one particular form of being, are characteristic of a great deal of contemporary research, as you might know. An aggressive, greedy species which exploits nature, abuses other animals, and slowly but surely destroys the planet, and whose ways of cognition, communication, reasoning, and moralizing are designed to perpetuate violence, receives and from itself as that something like a motion of non-confidence, votum недоверия. This motion aims at the very heart of a long humanist tradition, which gradually displays its dark, seamy side. Human being manages to convince himself, at least theoretically, that that which is different from him and which was, for this very reason, continuously neglected, repressed, abused, or underestimated by him, by the human, deserves to be rehabilitated or redeemed. Nature, for example, or whatever. And indeed, ultimately, all things are different from human being except human being itself. An entire world seems to turn back to human, unwilling to remain in his possessions. Conceptualizing the non-human in this post-humanist vein leaves an impression that there is at least, at last, on the one hand, an infinite multiplicity of the world of worlds that are not human, and on the other, a human being as if staying apart, disgrassed, all alone. However, upon a closer view, it gets clear that in this picture, with all due disrespect towards human being, the very same human being still occupies a central place. His principal position only changed from its value from a positive to a negative one. Everything is centered on him as before, but from centripetal, the general direction of the non-human turned into centrifugal. This is yet another way of understanding the meaning of its return. If there is something in common between all possible non-human things in the world, it is their negative determination with regards to the human in this kind of approach, which I am not trying to characterize. While being actively denied, human thus remains a main constitutive element of their identity, a kind of general equivalent. Elephants, flowers, clouds, cyborgs, stones, stars, zombies, and others all unite against the backdrop of the one that they are not. No less than a universal non-humanity is born by this tectonic shift, but it is doomed to be, so to say, negatively anthropocentric, constituted by the horizon of the non around the human. He is not a part of this multiplicity. He is excluded from it, but precisely from this position of the excluded, he keeps providing it with some consistency and meaning. One of the main driving forces of such a return of the non-human is thus negation, in both Hegelian and Freudian sense. Trying to extend Hegelian logic to the human-non-human relation, one can consider the non as that which mediates between these two opposites, each of which, as Hegel says, and I quote Science of Logic, therefore simply is, first, to the extent that the other is. It is what it is by virtue of the other, by virtue of its own non-being. It is only positiveness. Second, it is to the extent that the other is not. It is what it is by virtue of the non-being of the other. It is reflection into itself. End of quote. Furthermore, the non not only indicates that the one is the other for the other, and that they negate, constitute, define, and affect each other, but also that these two terms are neither symmetrical nor stable. The non is what transforms their mere opposition into a productive contradiction. Meanwhile, from the very beginning, a non-human explicitly contains and presupposes human. The non here is needed to go beyond metaphysical binaries towards a complex process of exclusion, alienation, and self-alteration, or becoming other, which is, after all, according to Hegel, the only way to arrive to oneself, to come back to being through one's own non-being. Thus, seen through the lenses of Hegelian dialectic, the non-human turn is definitely a necessary part of humans' self-determination. Slavoj Žižek repeatedly emphasizes an extreme importance and wide applicability of the notion of determinations of opposition, introduced by Hegel in the cited chapter from The Science of Logic. Žižek calls them oppositional determinations and focuses on radical asymmetry of the terms involved. He points, for instance, at a strange overlap, I quote, when the universal common ground of the two opposites encounters itself in its oppositional determination, i.e. in one of the terms of the opposition. End of quote. Each one being the other for the other, the two terms are now not simply opposed but contradict each other as a universal claim or idea and a particular element which is taken as a genuine agent. One of the basic examples will be quite relevant here, since it has to do with the classical philosophical opposition between human and animal. In the chapter The Animal That I Am, of his Less Than Nothing, Žižek develops his original critical stance on Derrida's deconstruction of human-animal distinction, developed mainly in Derrida's late work on animality, especially in his 10 hours late seminar, The Animal That Therefore I Am, where Derrida undermines traditional philosophical ideas that man differs from all other animals according to a certain generalized criteria, be it language or thought, knowledge, awareness of death, etc. Philosophers were always concerned about such a criteria. In this regard, Derrida even claims that, I quote, one understands a philosopher only by heeding closely what he means to demonstrate, and in reality fails to demonstrate concerning the limit between human and animal. For Derrida, however, the question is not what the true and ultimate criterion of differentiation is, so that already existing ones turn invalid again and again when there appear evidences that certain animals fall under the same parameters. For instance, a philosopher claims that animals do not speak and only humans do, and the child replies to this generalization by pointing at a parrot, or a paradigmatic example of famous Plato's definition: man is a biped without feathers. Diogenes replies by taking a picked chicken and saying, look, Plato's man. Such a move is often triggered by science, which always brings about some important updates on animals' intelligence, language, complicated ways of communication, developed models of social behavior, creativity, etc. Discoveries of this kind prompt to search for yet another criterion of definition of human being, as the previous were compromised, like animals to communicate or something like this. And this only shifts the border, separating it from the rest of the animal kingdom. For Derrida, the question is not, the question is how this very differentiation, where there are humans on the one hand and all other animals on the other, is ever possible. Deconstruction shows that this binary is absolutely illegitimate and based on a massive repression of diversity of the living species for the sake of just one of them. A violent merging of various multiple animals into an abstract homogeneous unit of the animal shadows, for Derrida, the arbitrariness and tyranny of anthropocentric categories and limits imposed by them. The limit of the animal is a threshold beyond which no animal allegedly can step, and he says, where the animal stops, the limit at which it comes to a halt must stop or be arrested. End of quote. Derrida's aim is, however, I quote again, not in effacing the limit, but in multiplying its figures, in complicating, thickening, delinearizing, folding, and dividing the line precisely by making it increase and multiple. End of quote. It may be true that Derrida makes hay of philosophers' persistent and failed attempts to separate themselves as humans from some generalized animality, and yet, as Žižek claims, in response to this very powerful and influential line of argumentation, there is a way for a notorious human-animal distinction to be justified. A passage from Marx, which Žižek quotes in this chapter, provides a great illustration for a better comprehension of the core of the problem. In the first edition of the first volume of Capital, which is not in Russian translation, so this quote strangely, even though Marx is so well translated, this quote, you cannot find it because this particular introduction to the first German edition, whatever, was not somehow. So Marx explains the logic of the general equivalent using the following metaphor, I quote. It is as if alongside and external to lions, tigers, rabbits, and all other actual animals, which form, when grouped together, the various kinds, species, subspecies, families, etc. of the animal kingdom, there existed in addition the animal, the individual incarnation of the entire animal kingdom. End of quote. Of course, one would say Derrida was right. Such an animal as such does not exist. It is just an abstract idea. However, this is a real abstraction, of which money is, of course, a perfect case. A universal equivalent is abstract, and yet it is real. Yes, an exchange value doesn't initially belong to a thing. It just attaches to it, but it equally attached to all other things. That's why it is called a universal equivalent. Since it attached to all things of the world, it is now something which they have in common, they share. They are determined by it. By a value forms, things are transformed into commodities, and hence what was conceived as a mere abstraction and a kind of unnecessary external supplement becomes the very intrinsic essence of these things and constitute the reality of capital, which consists not of things but of commodities, which means things whose essence, the essence of which is this precisely this as such. If we read the Marxian metaphor literally, the same logic applies to animality. A solitary animal as such, running alongside the heterogeneous pack of all really existing animals, but at the same time attached to every single individual in this pack, is a real abstraction which paradoxically unites such singular entities as tigers and rabbits and transforms them into animals. He is a universal equivalent for the tiger and the rabbit. They all have this animal as their representative. He incarnates them, and they too now keep him, so to say, somewhere deeply inside of them as their very essence. The problem starts with the question how to locate the animal as such. Does he himself belong to the multiplicity of animals which he incarnates? Does he encounter himself in one particular species and is therefore a species himself? Thus, real abstraction is hampered not only by the problem of oppositional determination, but also by Russell's famous paradox of a set of all sets that do not include themselves. This ultimate set includes itself only if it does not, and does not only if it does. It is also known as the Barber paradox, although Russell himself denied that this popular version was his own. So the barber is a man in town who shaves all those and only those men in town who do not shave themselves. But who then shaves the barber? Since the claim applies to the barber himself, the answer, but not the solution, is that either he shaves himself only if he doesn't, or he doesn't only if he does. A real abstraction, right? A real abstraction falls in the same trap. As a value form, it commodifies things, but at the same time, it is itself a kind of paradoxical non-commodified commodity, a commodity without body. As an animal as such, it animalizes tigers and rabbits, but cannot quite animalize itself. Again, it runs without a proper animal body. There is something in common between commodifying things, animalizing tigers, and shaving men. Someone or something should do this job, but if they do, they cannot really exist. One of the frequent quasi-solutions of the Barber paradox has a form of a joke. From the standard paradox, it omits one important detail, namely the gender of a barber, who now claims in the first person, I shave all those and only those men in town who do not shave themselves. It is clear that the barber shaves men, but it is not clear either this barber is a man or woman. If we want to escape a paradox entirely, the barber should be a woman, since the claim applies only to men in town. Gender rearrangement changes everything. Since a man is fired and a woman is hired by the barber shop, the town is rid of the burden of a paradox. Although this is a joke that seemingly has nothing to do with the initial paradox of the proper paradox of a male barber, there is, as in every joke, a grain of truth. The truth is that a sudden intervention of the other breaks the continuity and immediacy of a given set. A logical paradox takes place within a closed, homogeneous structure, a key element of which cannot sustain an unavoidable encounter with itself. Paradox is pre-dialectical, so encounter not with the other, but with itself is the problem of the paradox. Paradox is pre-dialectical. It deals with an identity that does not yet know difference, doesn't know other, and is caught in a deadlock of pure positivity and self-referentiality. It is the town of the bearded men, бородатые мужчины, bearded men, who are thrown upon their own devices and whose innocent attempts to shave each other are doomed to a logical failure. Bearded men are captured in a closed circuit of self-referentiality until a woman enters in the town and shaves everyone. A logical paradox doesn't have a solution in desired condition. It can only be resolved when the condition changes. The gates of the town open and the stranger crosses its border. Or better to say, her intervention doesn't resolve, but dissolves a paradox for the sake of something else. The female barber doesn't shave herself, but since she is beardless, it's not a problem any longer. In turn, she introduces such a new thing as a sexual difference, and thus brings in town an even bigger trouble. Instead of a logical paradox, the set of bearded men have to confront a dialectical contradiction, with which the very act of the shift from the logical paradox to dialectical contradiction, right? With which the very act of shaving becomes something of a great importance. Let me now draw a parallel between an animal as such, who cannot find its proper place among actually existing tigers and rabbits, and an unfortunate barber who does not know what to do with his beard, while shaving all the rest in the town of men. Like this bearded barber, the animal as such would have stayed in the trap of a paradox of being a member of himself, of his own set, on conditions that there were only animals on earth. Coming back to Derrida and Žižek, one can indicate two respective vectors of dealing with this difficulty. As it was already mentioned, Derrida doesn't aim to efface the limit between animal and man, but he wants to multiply and complicate differences, to re-establish heterogeneity and to rather rid of such an absurd figure as the animal as such, which makes the world of living beings break up into two equal parts by reducing all tigers and rabbits to the same level of animals, altogether, as opposed to a human being dwelling beyond their limit. Such philosophers as Descartes think that animals cannot reply, and this is their limit, according to Derrida. But what if animals replied, asks Derrida. Assuming that they can reply within a deconstructionist framework, neither results in yet another shifting of the limit. If a capacity to reply doesn't work, one can always introduce a new criteria of differentiation, nor does this assuming make animals a part of a human world, as endowed with human capacities, and therefore deserving compassion, respect, etc., etc. This perspective suggests two angles of pure and simple humanist deadlock, Derrida. Instead, Derridian animals would probably anarchistically reply that they do not want to be animalized, named, classified, counted, etc., deprived of their irreducible singularity and merged under the heading of the animal as such, who, although he hardly exists, pretends to be their very essence, not only their master. Similarly, all the men in town could reply that they simply don't want to be shaved. They would prefer to stay bearded, to keep the diversity of their beards against the violent uniformity of shave. The bearded men would probably even ask the barber, who treated them all alike, to leave the town and to leave them alone. Thus, they would express their collective refusal of a certain kind of symbolic castration, which in human society serves as a main step to manhood, like initiation. Žižek's proposal is totally different. He apparently gets down playing devil's advocate in order to challenge what he calls the common sense of deconstruction, which in this case is presented by Derrida's intention to denounce the all-encompassing category of the animal. The necessary evil contained in this category displays a reduction to a minimal difference and an introduction of a minimal distance. As Žižek explains, to put it in Hegel's, it is not only that, say, the totalization effected under the heading the animal involves the violent obliteration of a complex multiplicity, it is also that the violent reduction of such a multiplicity to a minimal difference is the moment of truth. This is to say, the multiplicity of animal forms is to be conceived as a series of attempts to resolve some basic antagonism or tension which defines animality as such, a tension which can only be formulated from a minimal distance once humans are involved. End of quote. Although this doesn't sound like a joke, the solution proposed by Žižek for the animal as such and its pack is in a way analogous to the one with the female barber. It is as if an animal as such were himself not really an animal among animals, but a human being. So the animal as such, this animal who ranks outside the pack, is the human, in Zizek's, as he suggests. In this vein, he even refers to the early Marx definition of the Gattungswesen as species being, according to which man is an indeterminate creature who doesn't really belong to this or that species, and precisely due to this lack of any specific determination, becomes both a universal producer and a producer of the universal. A quotation from Economical and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844 by Marx. An animal forms objects only in accordance with the standard and the need of the species to which it belongs, whilst man knows how to introduce in accordance with the standard of every species and knows how to apply everywhere the inherent standard to the object. End of quote. Almost like a woman in the town of Bearded Man, this strange being intrudes into an animal kingdom and introduces a minimal difference, which after all creates such a mess that tigers and rabbits look at this creature in perplexity. This is the end of a paradox and the beginning of an antagonism. It is human being who now animalizes animals, that is, produces animals out of tigers and rabbits according to his standards, and who is to be blamed for a violent reduction, shaving, castration, slaughtering, torturing, and extermination of various kinds of real existing living beings. And this is, following Zizek's argument, precisely what animality is. Not a humanity, but precisely what animality is. The animal as such is not the animal other of the human. He is the animal other of the animal. Right? He projects and imposes animality on really existing tigers and rabbits. We see them and recognize them as animals. We put them all in one and the same zoo. But what do they see while looking at us? Asked Zizek. The animal as such. Zizek gives a striking example of a cat, I quote, after it had been subjected to some lab experiment in a centrifuge. Its bones half broken, its skin half hairless, its eyes looking hopelessly into the camera, end of quote, and suggests that what the cat's gaze express, I quote, is perhaps the cat's horror at having encountered the animal, namely ourselves, humans, what the cat sees in us in all our monstrosity, and what we see is in its tortured case is our own monstrosity, says Zizek. Commenting on this, he applies Lacanian notion of the symbolic to what I already characterized as a real abstraction. One more quote. The big other, the symbolic order, is already here for the poor cat. Like the prisoner in Kafka's penal colony, the cat suffered the material consequences of being caught in the symbolic gridlock. It effectively suffered the consequences of being named included in the symbolic network, end of quote. Yes, the animal as such might hardly exist, but he really affects existence, leaves material traces on their bodies, and reflects in their eyes. As regards to the encounter between an animal gaze and man's own animality, I must refer to another example which is very significant for the history of psychoanalysis. Oh, nice, I'm close to the end, so, don't worry. Yeah, when this example means for me that, you don't want me to stop. Okay. Namely, a famous Freudian Wolfman case. Here, an animal gaze stays as a turning point of the whole story. After a period of quite unsuccessful, due to a strong resistance, analytic treatment started in 1910, Sergei Pankeev, Russian patient of Freud, suddenly recounts a dream which he allegedly saw when he was a little child. And I quote, for those who don't know the story, "I dreamt that it was night and that I was lying in bed. My bed stood with its foot towards the window. In front of the window there was a row of old walnut tree. I know it was winter when I had the dream at night time. Suddenly the window opened of its own accord, and I was terrified to see that some white wolves were sitting on the big walnut tree in front of the window. There were 6 or 7 of them. The wolves were quite white and looked more like foxes or sheepdogs, for they had big tails like foxes, and they had their ears pricked like dogs when they pay attention to something. In great terror, evidently of being eaten up by the wolves, I screamed and woke up." End of quote. One of the most important details of the dream is that the white wolves sat motionlessly on the tree, staring fixedly at the boy. Freud considerably advanced in his investigation of this case when he applied a notion of inversion, when something in the dream transforms into its opposite in order to stay disguised. First of all, together with his patient, he suggested that it was in fact not the window of his bedroom, but his own eyes which were suddenly opened, as if the window were just one of the layers of his eyes, and the bedroom an extension of his sleeping. Not of his sleeping body, even of the interior of his head. Then followed an assumption that the gaze of the wolves was actually patient's own gaze. It was the boy himself who was staring with the fixed gaze of the wolves, with the fearsome eyes of wolves at something terrible which occupied now his own place. I quote, "The attentive gaze which in the dream he attributes to the wolves is actually to be ascribed to him." Finally, the stillness of the wolves indicated an intense, violent motion there on the side of the scene. What does the boy see with the wolf's eyes? His parents in a sexual intercourse, Freud replies, thus coming up with his hypothesis, with this famous hypothesis of a primal sin. The idea that the wolf's fascinated gaze is the dreaming subject himself was strongly emphasized further by Lacan. The subject passes beyond this glass in which he always sees entangled his own image, Lacan says. According to Lacan, this encounter of the subject with himself, eyes to eyes, is a privileged experience of an ultimate real, which only a dream can provide. The fact that the subject encounters itself implies that it is not one, that it is split, and that there are at least 2 parts of it which meet halfway. The external, both are somehow the external other of the oneself. One would ask, however, what is the place of a true subject here? Is he there or here or precisely in between? Is it within or beyond the glass or the window? Who or what comes first, a boy, an integral unity of a human being which produces a fantasy, or white wolves, as some primordial animal multiplicity reveals in the dream? In Lacan's psychoanalytic theory, so in Deleuze, if you read Deleuze's interpretation, those are the wolves who come first in all their multiple pack. In Lacan's psychoanalytic theory, what comes first is a split itself. This impossible relation is established by an absolute other or an essential alien who is neither the supplement nor the complement of the fellow being, who is the very image of dislocation of the essential tearing apart of the subject, end of quote. In a way, the task of psychoanalysis consists in shedding light on this essential alien, which Zizek also calls an inhuman core of the human. This is a very interesting expression in which negativity is so clearly exposed. The inhuman is not simply opposite to the human. These two terms are asymmetrical, and from mere opposition they leap into a true dialectical contradiction. The in of the inhuman has two meanings. It points at that which is not human, and at the same time at that which is inside. So inhuman with kind of non-human, and inhuman, within human, inside. The inhuman is thus a human with an alien within, as an essential alien, as it were, or in other words, what is within human, its inner self is an other, an alien. I is an other, repeats Lacan after Rimbaud. On the semantic level, an interesting parallel can be drawn between the inhuman, the unhuman, and the German Unmensch. As emphasized by Jean-Claude Milner, in German language, the prefix un is not always as flatly negative as the Latin prefix in. Thus, Unmensch is not a non-human, but an undone man, a monster. Unkraut is not a herb, kraut, but a weed, a parasite. The unheimlich is not the inverse of the familiar, but the familiar parasitized by an anxiety that disperses it. In a similar manner, in psychoanalysis, the unconscious perpetually, I still quote Milner, perpetually parasitized consciousness, thereby manifesting how consciousness can be other than it is, yet not without a cost. It establishes precisely how it cannot be other. The negative prefix is nothing more than the seal of this parasitism, end of quote. I must add also to this list one more word, which I actually borrow from Frank's paper about ontir, which again means not a non-animal, but again a kind of monster, which Marx applies to proletarians, actually, which is not an animal, not a man, but a kind of like stunning monster. It's unconscious. No, the question isn't unconscious, a territory where unmensch meets untier. That is, a territory of the animal as such, which digs in or attaches to really existing animals like a parasite. With the non-human, the situation looks slightly different. By talking, for instance, about non-human subjects, non-human animals, non-human primates, etc., we are seemingly getting rid of an ambiguity of an animal as such, or a human beast. It must be noticed that just one more aspect now will appear, so pay attention. It must be noticed that the non-human is a negative multiplicity, a negative set, which includes itself. A Barber's paradox doesn't apply to it. Each and every non-human being never shaves, since only humans shave, and what contains all the non-humans, the non-humanity, is indeed itself non-human. Not the positivity of the animal, which was a subject to Derridian deconstruction, but a negativity on the negated. Negation is a way of taking cognizance of what is repressed. The outcome of this is a kind of intellectual acceptance of the repressed, while at the same time what is essential to the repression persists. End of quote from Freud. In such cases, no is just a, I quote again, a hallmark of repression, a certificate of origin, like, let's say, made in Germany. End of quote. as Mladen Dolar comments on this, the dreams knows no no. There is no no in this vocabulary. Actually, one more quote from Dolar, very witty. Negation, which characterized this move as a Freudian kind of negation, which dialectically relates to the Hegelian one with which I started these papers. Negation is like a certificate of origin. It testifies to the origin of repression, and if there is indeed a negation made in Germany, of all places, it must be the Hegelian negation. One could say, with all the ambiguity of the statement, this is not Hegelian negation, on the model of this is not my mother. Is Hegelian negation thus accepted or rejected? Do we have to decide between this is a Hegelian negation and this is not a Hegelian negation? End of quote. So in a dreamlike language of the unconscious, no simply means yes. In this sense, the insistence of the known in the non-human turn can be interpreted as the persistence of the human that paradoxically paves through his way through this self-obliteration, as well as the own of the unmensch is a hallmark of a parasitic monstrosity of an animal as such, as an alien within a human subject. The known of the non-human would be a hallmark of repression, a certificate of origin of human's birth out of its own negation. Human and non-human turn around each other and return to each other as repressed. What makes this possible is the fact that not only everything is different from the human being, except for a human being itself, but furthermore, even a human being itself is different from itself. It is an other. It never coincides with itself. It too is non-human, and is and even like the human is a non-human as such. If psychoanalysis deals with the inhuman core of the human, then the return of the non-human, there is a human core which operates through negation, through everything but. The non-human dream is populated by monsters, human elephants, human clouds, human stones, human zombies, and human stars. Yeah.
Maybe a couple of quotes from Zizek, or not yet. Okay. So thank you very much for this statement. So questions, there should be many. Please.
Thank you. This was very rich, but not always easy to follow. So could you recapitulate?
It was actually my question.
Yeah, no, but you are a genius. No, but for simple people, I just want some recapitulation. Just repeat very briefly, summarize.
Yes.
So dialectic, where is the position, counter position, negation, inversion? If you can spell this out for me, that would be helpful. And another question, as for the real abstraction. The real, this animal as such, you are claiming that this is a human being, but there is an alternative possibility that maybe it is actually a protozoa, a cell. Because according to the abstract reason, the money of animality is a cell, not a human being.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So like
a cell means клетка. Mm-hmm. No, but the plants too contain cells, so the everything which is living contains cells. So this brings this into, this adds yet another level into the ontology of this idea of real abstraction when it brings life as, because the cell is the element of what they call, what is called life, right? Or I'm I'm wrong, and only humans and animals share some cells, and plants they don't even like. Yeah. No, they do.
There are cells that are animals, protozoa. Yes, they are not plants.
Ah, the little yeah okay, I know what you mean. But we do not consist of these proto animals, so the.
Yes, in fact, like at least your stomach.
Okay, maybe.
Well, so the interesting is like, okay, cell as a unit of life, let's say. Life is, it's like cells are the life's cache. So this is yet another idea of a certain, which is like the problem of the vitalist ontology can appear towards it, and that's how it can be. The question could be read like now with regards to that. But like what is important in this case, in this quotation, is this idea of the minimal difference. So if this is used, then there is a kind of like in this brutal, let's say, divide. There is a certain mechanism which actually positively creates a certain, like the diversity appears due to this element of a contradiction. Let's say. Should I try to summarize now all what I said?
If you
Because this was a.
Where do you see the dialectic?
The dialectic in between this exchange. So basically, the idea is super simple. Like this presupposition that there was for centuries there was this anthropocentric perspective which brought so many violence and so on and so forth. So now, because everything was centered on men, etc., so now let's pay attention to all what is not human because it is repressed in a way. And then I'm just trying to say that paradoxically, like man remains in the center of this very construction. Yes. It's just that the direction of the direction is changed. Not everything tends towards human, but everything turns against it. But the exchange of the gaze is still persists through this idea of negation. And the funny thing is that it's both like this question. On this example, we can see how Hegelian negation meets a Freudian one, which supposedly to be a non-dialectical, but in fact, like he like, or rather, as like Mladen Dolar would say, hysterical or something like this. The yes means no, and so on and so forth. How the animal, not the animal, the non-human actually affirms this. This basic construction. Is it clear somehow or not?
But we can clarify something maybe if Oksana will answer some.
The other, because I just realized that I'm in a danger of starting to reproduce what I was talking about, and I want again to emphasize this idea in between, this difference between the logical paradox and the dialectical contradiction. What I say, when you introduced a certain element alien to the certain multiplicity, which seems to be heterogeneous, like non-human, but actually remains homogeneous. And is easily and being and meet some troubles when the other intervenes in a way.
So it's the logic of exception, so to say, right? The set and an exception.
Yeah, and then an exception provides the consistency to the set, of course. But
the other version is two parts, so contradiction of two parts. And you are saying that actually what seemed to be a dialectical contradiction is in fact a unitary set with an exception.
No, there are two types. Like the first type is like the contradiction, the Russell thing, which is like the exception of the set is what includes the set. In the second case, like there is no paradox because it is not a part of what because it's a negative set, non-human. That's the problem. If it's non-human, so there is no paradox. But still, yet there is another dialectic, which is like Freudian. There is another negation, which is here at stake, and then they meet.
So maybe yes, maybe indeed with some other question, Jan or Frank. No.
I'm sorry. I think it concerns the same point you've been touching now in the end of your last answer. Somehow, I mean, thank you for the wonderful idea of the solution of the paradox by the female Barber. But I was wondering from the point where you started to talk about this, I was really wondering how does this dialectic female Barber find this village in which all these men have this paradox and cannot escape from it by themselves? How is actually the change taking place between the paradox, the scene of the paradox, the Barber paradox, and the introduction of an element which opens up for another dialectics? Because I think, I mean, like, and then, I mean, if it happens at somehow, because you said like this is the transformation into another dialectics, no? And this opens you the possibility to conceive of the relation between human and animal in a different way, namely by having the, let's say, the accepted big other animal as part of the animals and the somehow inhuman human on the side of the humans. No, I mean, I hope I understood correctly. But I wondered how this change is taking place from the paradox to the dialectical scene, and if, I mean, after it has taken place, what becomes of the paradox? Is not the paradox somehow then, to put it like this, the other for the dialectical scene? Does it not insist at some point?
So, like the passage is not between. So the passage is not between the one dialectics and another, but between logics and like certain simple logics, paradoxical and dialectics. And what happens to the paradox in this case? So it just being well, it's easy to think that it is kind of sublated with the contradiction, right? I don't know actually. I think maybe it's not, but. I think the entire city changes if it happens, which is yeah, or the.
Yes.
Well, if we are taking. Right, or as like another opting, but when maybe not entirely. What we were talking about the anthropogenesis, for example, is the like this is another illustration of how to say another example of such a shift. Like we cannot know the perspective which was before the shift. So retrospectively, we produced a certain paradoxical, not a dialectical, but a paradoxical community of the same animals with their mirror brain, mirror neurons, etc., etc., empathy. They those are like men shaving each other and so on, so the element intervenes which excludes itself, and then already it cannot be cannot exist otherwise than a dialectical, because all the projections of the previous existing community of living beings is his retrospective ideas about himself before he became the one whom he is, or whom he is actually not, because all his existence based on the negation of whom he is, might something like this.
So he negates himself all the time.
All right, yes, yeah,
But what actually,
he does.
From where actually Zizek take this idea of minimal difference? It means that so it's
from Badiou,
Badiou.
which he interpreted wrongly, as maybe some people
because
explain me. I don't understand.
Because I remember that he used this idea of minimal reference in relation to
Difference.
Deleuze, into Deleuze, because he quotes his from the cinema, I think. So he claims that Deleuze used this notion. So, but it looks like he used it in different way. So it's so, but we can clarify if you
Yeah.
Sorry for.
I'm a bit confused about one thing. You started this passage you quoted from Marx that Slavoj also uses, right? In the animal kingdom, besides all species and subspecies, there is the animal. And Marx says that, or said that, about money, right? So, and the twist I always thought with this quote is, there is no problem that besides all commodities, that what makes it possible to exchange commodities appears itself as a commodity. This is no problem at all. It's money. But because it relies on the logic of capital, and capital never appears. Capital is, so you see, you get a minimal shift. It is a minimal difference in the sense of, let's say, white square on white ground, right? I mean, capital is the bracket that makes it unproblematic, which that's the animal, besides all species and individual animals, can appear in the series of commodity. Money is a commodity which makes it possible to generate more of it. And hence, I thought, from this perspective, this logic seems to be a logic which relies on a constitutive element that does not appear in the set it establishes, right? So a phallic signifier somehow. But the Russell paradox somehow works differently, right? And I thought you sort of got from the one to the other, and then this got me confused, because adding the woman seems to be like adding capital to the description. It is the one thing that doesn't appear, right? But somehow this doesn't make a shift of perspective, right? You don't get from logic to dialectics, you just get dialectics somehow. I mean, you see, it is the same thing. You just like, you seriously change it because you bring out what was implicit, to speak the shitty language of Robert Brandom, what was implicit before, what was hidden, but constitutively hidden because it made the whole structure. So this, I mean, would you subscribe to that? And because linked to this is my second very short question. What is repressed in talking about the non-human? Is the human repressed or the inhuman? I mean, or both? Because I think the two relate, the two questions relate.
Depressed?
So it's
No,
like
the press
return
is what appears together with the repression. So it's a certain, how to say, the product or what accompanies repression itself. So it's the thing which accompanies the process. Or what is? It's not prior to the certain repression, the negation. It's
right? If you say it's not, this is not the human, it can be the inhuman. So you see, it produces a third category which somehow fuses the two, doesn't it? Because you're saying
Does.
non-human, so you're basically saying inhuman, but you're also saying human, because you just negated human.
Right. I think that's what I was trying to formulate. Yeah, yeah. And the previous comment, yes, but I didn't go that far. Like I think you add something necessary to this structure, like how. Well, I was thinking about this passage between logic and dialectics and the appearance of the certain third element. But I just didn't go so far. Right. Thank you.
But yeah.
Can I
Yes, please.
just follow, because I think it links quite explicitly to something that Frank said, but also to the original question that Artemi made. I mean, methodologically, are you, this is a really blunt question, are you endorsing Zizek's take on the being of the animal, and hence his philosophy of nature? Because my impression, and that's a request for clarification, was that generally you did, but then I lost some passages. So that would be a specific question. I mean, methodologically, clearly, you're endorsing his critique of Derrida, and I think most of us in this room would endorse that critique. But then, what is the ontological status of the animal? I know, I mean, to answer this question in one sentence would eliminate the problem of writing a book that takes years. But that is a question I didn't get. Because if the answer is Zizek's answer, then I think there's a whole debate to be had about what Zizek's philosophy of nature is, which is super problematic for me, at least personally.
What is it?
His philosophy.
Not everyone knows that Zizek has a philosophy of nature.
Yeah.
No, he
Well,
has nature doesn't exist and so on. So,
It is for me, in short, it is an anthropocentric projection of sexual difference onto nature. And then there are elements, also there are Schellingian elements, etc., etc., etc. So to open up the debate, maybe the idea for me is that Slavoj's philosophy of nature is far from being guaranteed as the uber-materialist philosophy of nature you would like it to sell it like. And clearly, like the understanding of the animal one has on that basis, well, the understanding of the animal one has is based on what your general ontology as a philosophy of nature is, right? So my question for Oxana was more or less like a methodological question. And basically, are you supporting Zizek's notion of the animal? I know that the question is simple, but...
It's this precise notion of the animal he develops in this critique of Derrida. I'm sympathetic to that. Although in this particular piece, I'm using Zizek constructions rather as a tool to distance from the deconstruction. Yeah. So the critique of Derrida is the main point where I take Zizek as a comrade. Then what concerns philosophy of nature and his idea of the materialism which he develops in a critique of the all kinds of like different materialisms is quite close. I'm quite close to what Ljubljana School of Psychoanalysis, let's say, think about the nature of the human being and so on and so on. Although, first of all, like, I'm not a Lacanian. So the...
But you're a Zizekian.
No, I'm not a Zizekian. I'm not even a Batayan. Although,
friends, let's have a as moderator, I should say.
Yeah, it could seem what I'm talking about could seem too much of a Batayan from the Zizek's point of view. I would say maybe. Currently, I'm working on the problem of the human soul, which is again, there are certain questions to psychoanalysis to be addressed, but at the same time, the animal which I'm trying to bring from there into the light of consciousness has even much more in common with myself than psychoanalysis of Ljubljana would suggest, actually. And probably the main, the two things which I cannot really fully endorse are the basic things, which are the principal things, which are sexual difference first, and the place of a language, the super important in Lacan. So this is my point of departure, what I cannot share with on this stage of my work, which I cannot really share with Zizek, let's say. But it's interesting to develop all the line of this. Departing from something always makes sense when you are in a kind of like a critical discussion and endorsement at the same time. You have to you have your own points which are brought down by some other authors. Like let's say in this concept of negation, which also like what I would really like to suspend is the idea of negativity, because recently one is well, there are so many interpretations of that, but it's like it's another. So for me, materialism and negativity are, first of all, it's not the post-humanism or the non-human, which can to be which must be suspended and put into the question, but the negativity, the materialism, and the idea of on what Zizek's let's say negative materialism is based, the idea of a split, of a cut, of this principal moment of a certain initial split, which produces the subject, which produces the humanity, which produces the symbolic, etc., etc., and which is somehow the split itself, which is the very first essence, let's say, of being, the rupture, the cut, which goes first and has to be questioned in its ontological status, and even maybe like, is this the God? This empty split, this is interesting to think about it, although I didn't, but like here I would propose to ask ourselves to the very ideas to which we are trying to stick, but those are the most problematic. Like what is the mother of negativity or something like this?
Yeah. And probably the last question or comment.
Thank you, Oxana. I really enjoyed your talk. My question that is not a question to you for necessarily answer, but rather a rhetorical conjecture is first. I would say that in contemporary counter-humanist researches, this issue of not excluding the human denominator is already taken into account. So I would say that all of them already have this alienated little differential within them to construct the elemental framework to include this deviated inhuman within them rather than keep them as a generalized abstraction. And I think then that this happens already in speculative realism. This happens in most recent research of cyberfeminism. But at the same time, my stupid question would be why the monstrous inhuman is and unconscious and untier is good and the general human is bad. Yeah, it sounds very simple but very difficult to answer. And another thing is whether the value form, which is this superimposed abstraction, whether this is the only way of generalization, whether the value form and the money form is the only way of generalization, and whether general can exist in other forms, and hence the human could have existed in other conditions of generalization.
Great. Значит, first, I do not say that the monstrous is good and the ordinary man is bad. No, each ordinary man is a monster, is monstrous. And here I would my position, let's say the theoretical position, I would call it now, apropos to this subject, radical revolutionary humanism. Which I characterize it like this, and I arrived to it recently, thinking precisely about the idea of a human soul as an animal. Like a human soul is an animal, is a Platonov's expression. I took it from his very short essay called "Human Soul is an Obscene Animal," where he is talking about the revolutionary, the Bolshevik, who goes without pants, whose soul is, as he says, free from the laundry and the boots of decency, is obscene. So how human beings introduce the obscenity into the animal kingdom and so on and so forth. And then the animality of the soul is the principal moment for me in which in which way I continue more or less saying that there is a certain, there is this transformation or metamorphosis which we didn't, which we still didn't which we still didn't pass through. So we still are not human. We still didn't become human, as it was said already today, but not in a way that, because this expression belongs to Donna Haraway. Basically, we have never been human, but she's talking about we have never been human. She refers to Latour. We have never been modern, but she means basically by we. She means the friends, not the enemies, like white men, but her dog cybers and all this kind of those who were not associated with the classical subject. But my idea is rather that even we male, etc., we too didn't yet go through this interesting procedure of a proper negation of our animal origin, but this is connected to the idea of the very animality of the human soul, which is itself a transformation and has to deal with actually the difference between metempsychosis and metamorphosis, and comes back to the Aristotelian idea of the human soul, which still derives from this Greek belief that the soul is actually the animal life, which comes from one body to another. And his example is actually, there is a very nice book by doesn't matter, Miran Božović, who emphasized this interesting idea that Aristotle is talking about the butterfly, and actually he describes the process how the butterfly appears from this kind of a dead body, so as a soul, and he even like equates use as the synonyms like a butterfly, or as they say, the soul, the psychic substance. And something changes with the modernity when the idea of metamorphosis, so the actual transformations, not that the soul migrates from one body to another, but the bodies itself change. So the radical revolutionary humanism presupposed a kind of meeting between the meeting point between the metamorphosis and metempsychosis, and is driven by the desire which the animal so in which the animal soul persists, which this desire should be interpreted not sexually and not biologically but politically. But this is already yet another issue which is somehow related to this, what I was talking about, but further radicalize it and really connects it to the topic of our conference, how the humanism must be reconsidered. So I just, like here, I just outline it, but actually I'm working on extending this point. This is like kind of preliminary notes to that.
Okay, I feel... No, but sorry? We have some other questions, or we gradually can... But I mean, generally, my comment, I think it would be... because I also was puzzled at many points of this concept, but still I try to think for good and think that Oxana, she's approaching to this sort of theorizing of her about this animal question and so on. It's very interesting and so on. But I just thought about this real abstraction, because we use it so often. I mean, it's like the state could be not just money, but state could be real abstraction. I don't know. Many things could be.
And those are also good and bad abstractions.
But rather, not animals are considered as a sort of real abstraction. This ideological discourse of non-humanity, you try to criticize, as I understand, as a sort of ideological discourse. But I would say that vice versa, maybe humans are real abstractions in a way that we, because Marx defines human as defines real abstraction as something.
Yes, this is.
Yes,
I said, but
yeah,
this was not my thesis. This was Zizek's thesis. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's good that I arrived at this point in the end of the. Okay. Yeah. Good.
Yeah, but there is a problem with the real abstraction. So it's even like the much.
No, because we act as if we exist, but we probably not so.
The universal, the good universal and the bad universal. Like how to invent a certain, as Katie proposed to talk about the good and evil. Like how to invent like good and universal. This I don't really know. I don't know.
Okay, so I think it was very rich, interesting day.